You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Welcome, everyone, to ESG News and Views. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the Conference Board ESG Center. The Conference Board is the world's leading independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank dedicated to serving the business community and society for over a century. At the ESG Center, we focus on delivering insights in the areas of corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. Welcome to part 2 of our podcast with Geralyn Ritter, who's Executive Vice President, External Affairs and ESG at Organon, a global healthcare company focused on women's health. In our first session, we talked with Geralyn about her experience in surviving a deadly Amtrak train accident in 2015, about her journey of recovery, and about her lessons of personal resilience. Today, we're going to focus more on what she learned relating to personal resilience and how that relates to professional and operational and organizational resilience more broadly, because Geralyn brings to this discussion not only her experience with this terrible, terrible accident, but also a wealth of experience in the corporate world where she's seen it all, basically. So, Geralyn, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted and honored to be here.
So, Geralyn, let's start with a general question. So, how would you compare personal resiliency with professional resiliency and organizational resiliency? On our last podcast, you talked about 5 key traits that related to personal resilience, including optimism, acceptance, action orientation, connection, and a sense of purpose. So that all helped you in becoming personally resilient. But are those same qualities relevant for professional and organizational resilience? Are they different? Or how would you compare and contrast those 3 areas?
I think there's tremendous overlap. The stakes are very different.
Mm-hmm.
The language we use is very different in the personal space versus the professional, and certainly the organizational space around resiliency. But the core concepts, the core skills or resilience muscles that we can work on really are quite similar. We talked in the last podcast about the importance of optimism and confidence. Mm-hmm. It was important that I did have a strong faith that things would get better. But it is also important that I ultimately, belatedly, faced the reality that it was not going to be on my time frame, and that I was actually a lot more hurt physically and emotionally than I had let myself realize early on in the recovery. And I can apply those 2 same things very easily to the corporate context. You need employees that are confident that the company is up to a challenge, right? Is up to a crisis. But it doesn't help if your leaders, don't hear, if information doesn't flow up, if leaders don't hear what's really happening on the ground and the challenges the business is facing. So, that balance between optimism, we can manage this, we can navigate this, but informed by cold, hard realities in the market or with respect to whatever crisis has happened, that can be a tricky balance, right? You want to encourage your employees, but you also need them to be realistic about what you're facing and what you need from them. Another parallel is that, in general, the healthier you are going into a crisis, mm-hmm. the better you're going to be equipped to navigate it. You certainly don't want to be facing a storm in a leaky rowboat, right?
Right.
And so all those good housekeeping things that we talk about, employee engagement, a strong culture, the importance of a safe to speak up type of environment, really are quite critical when the crisis hits. So sometimes we think of them, yes, as important, but the little bit of softer metrics, not as directly relevant to our results. But I would say when the crisis hits, those are probably your most important strengths as an organization to draw on. And I think we learned that during COVID, Organizations where employees felt a strong sense of purpose did extraordinary things. But if we didn't take care of them and they burnt out, the rates of departure from the workforce are really tragic and disheartening. And I think it caused people to do a lot of thinking about who they were working for, why they were working, why they were spending time commuting when perhaps they could be spending more time with their family. And we saw people really making some changes that I think will be with us for a long time. So all of those organizational health type metrics that are important in peacetime,
right.
even more important when you're facing the rough seas. And some of the other things we talked about, like a real bias for action, a real bias for figuring out what we can do and a willingness to experiment. Because when you're facing a crisis, some of the tools that you're used to going for may not be available. But do you have the flexibility? Do you allow the creativity in the organization? Do you have the right culture that rewards folks for saying, you know what, let's give this a shot? And I think that's really important with resilience as well. On the personal side, I've told this story. I had always dismissed healing techniques like yoga and meditation and breathing. I remember telling my husband when I was pregnant with my first son, I refused to go to childbirth classes because all that breathing exercises seemed very silly to me. I told him I had been breathing for 30 years and I was quite sure that I knew how to do it, and I did not need to spend 2 hours of my time being told to breathe. Well, guess what? Fast forward a couple of decades and I found myself in the throes of a lot of pain, a crushed chest, a reconstructive rib cage, weaning off very serious doses of fentanyl, sitting there with a yoga instructor working on deep breathing. And I got to tell you, I found it very boring. I still didn't like it. But the sense of agency, of control that it gave me over my body, it did help the pain. I'd had every surgery, every intervention, every drug Western medicine had to offer. And I had to open my mind a little bit to experimenting with ideas and things that I had always dismissed as being just not for me. Well, circumstances change, and maybe they are for you.
Yeah. No, I grew up in Woodstock, New York, where we were taught yoga before we could basically walk. So I have some of your same reservations about that. But look, I think, it's a few things strike me. That the list of qualities that you mentioned for personal resilience about confidence or optimism and acceptance and action orientation and connection and purpose are all the things you want from a leader during a crisis.
Absolutely.
It's also all things that an organization should cultivate as part of their ordinary culture, right?
Absolutely.
Like these are all traits that you want to have a truly resilient culture. And then the other thing you mentioned, which I think is really interesting too, is that your willingness to think afresh and to look at alternative means of support, of strengthening yourself to get through this time was also helpful. We put out a piece on the lessons that you can learn from sustainability and making your way through a crisis. And one of the things that's a characteristic of a good sustainability program is actually a willingness to listen to others. It's an open-mindedness. It's a willingness to change and adapt. And I think that's an interesting additional quality that organizations need to be truly resilient.
I think that's right. I think a strong ESG strategy is an element of resilience because by its nature, you are thinking long term.
Right.
You're thinking about those drivers within the organization that have potential for major disruption or can be incredible advantages to the company where they really exist. And that kind of thinking happens. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, really interesting. The connection between sustainability, ESG on the one hand, and resilience on the other. Another thing you mentioned was this notion of connection. And I just want to drill down on that because we are all working in a hybrid or remote work environment a lot. And we had a roundtable recently and conducted a survey with executives who are involved in operational resilience. These are your crisis management folks, it's your business continuity people and so forth. And one of the things that struck me about the survey results is we asked them, what do you think about the impact of remote work on your operational resilience? And, you'd expect it. They'd say, well, we're worried about, IT issues and someone hacking into your home computer, or, maybe someone's teenager walks away with your computer, leaves it on a train or something like that, right? So they're worried about IT. That came in number one. But all the next issues that concerned people who are, not normally known for focusing on this area were related to culture and employee well-being. So they were concerned about burnout. They were concerned about the lack of engagement. They were concerned about the lack of collaboration that happens naturally. So it was really interesting. They saw those very human issues impacting operational resilience. And I'm wondering, what's your thought about working in this remote environment and how you maintain a resilient organization in the kind of work environment we're in right now? Because you talked about, wheeling in once a month to meet with folks. You talk, and then your CEO could write to you, right? But you also were there in person. So I'm curious about your thoughts about the current work environment and how that affects organizational resilience.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers. I'm a big supporter of hybrid approaches to work. Sometimes we laugh from a technology perspective. They're the worst of all worlds, right? You got some people in the room, some people on the screen. It's hard to hear each other. But I actually think bigger picture, apart from any one particular meeting, giving employees more flexibility is got to be a good thing.
Right.
But I do understand and sympathize, and I think folks are correct, to have the concern that you go to fully remote, you really lose something very important. And it's good that we can collaborate in different ways.
Right.
That we don't have to be physically located, right? Anybody that's been in a global company is like, half the people I work with are on another continent.
Right.
We have to know how to work remotely with each other. But there is something human about the bonds. There's a trust that builds up. When I was coming back to work, I started out part-time. I wasn't sure if I was going to have the stamina to make it a full day. And every now and then I snuck into my office for mid-afternoon naps. But I have to say, I think it helped that people saw me.
Yes.
And because my injuries were all from kind of my neck to my waist, the scars don't show, and people would say, wow, I would never know, which I always kind of had mixed feelings because it's such an important part of me.
Of who you are.
My standard answer was, well, I'm glad I don't look like a train wreck. But I do think it helped from a, like I said, very personal perspective, build others' confidence in me that I was there for them, that I had their back. They didn't need to worry something was going to fall through the cracks because I just wasn't up for it. And it helped me reconnect with my friends, with my colleagues, with folks that had filled in for me for so long. So I do think we lose something, and I see it as a real challenge for managers now, that you've got to find ways for your team to connect. When you have those precious days together, shame on you if you're in your office the whole time doing video calls with somebody in another office. Do that on your not together days. We have to be more deliberate about our planning and using that time together. But that's all very doable. I think we're just in the process of adjusting to it.
Yeah, and it's deliberately, or I don't like the word intentional, but being intentional about the time you spend together and recognizing that time together does help to build the bonds of trust. Think about the bonds that are formed in a board meeting because people are there meeting in person and not just remotely, right? And they have the hallway conversations. I wonder if the folks at Silicon Valley Bank, if some of the directors there had a hallway conversation and said, wait, we got this note from the FDIC. We don't seem to be, or from the Federal Reserve. We don't seem to be doing enough about that. Let's go back in an executive session and talk about that, right?
Let's talk.
And that in-person side in the hallway kind of conversation can make a big difference too, and also the comfort and the reassurance level that it's okay to bring up issues to the top of the house when you see them. So, yeah, I think there's going to be some mix, but you don't want to lose, however it comes about, that ability to have. We're social animals, right? And building
That's right. And it goes beyond just our own employees and our own directors.
Yes.
In the ESG space, we talk a lot about stakeholder engagement.
Yes.
And I was in Washington last week. It was great that Congress is really back in person. Having these one-on-one meetings with members of Congress, with their staff, you can really have a different quality of conversation about the issues that are on your mind. When we work with third-party advocacy groups, with patient groups, there's a different human connection, especially when you're often talking about very sensitive medical issues. Working with regulators in an in-person meeting can be very different on Zoom when everybody's trying to look at a little chart on the
right.
That may or may not be coming through on the screen. So I think that kind of engagement, going back to conferences, meeting some of our investors face to face again instead of always on the phone. These are relationships that serve us well, but we have to invest in before the crisis hits.
Sure, and there are new relationships that companies need to be investing in. I think particularly, for example, in your involvement in government relations at the state level, because we're seeing state attorney generals and we're seeing, state treasurers and others taking quite divergent stands on ESG issues, and just had an opportunity to meet with a few former state AGs and a state treasurer recently. Completely different experience talking to them in person about what motivates them. And you realize that they may not be coming at this ideologically. They may actually be coming at this for quite different reasons. For example, it may not be a crusade against Facebook or Google or something like that just because of, their market dominance. It may be because, they're concerned about the harm that social media can do to kids. Right. And so there's this human aspect to the regulatory action, and you only get that when you're having those face-to-face interactions.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And maybe I said this before, but it's hard to develop those relationships in a crisis when you're under investigation.
Right.
It's like in your personal life. Who wants to date somebody on the rebound? No. Get your life together, then call me.
Right. Well, let me ask you a couple other questions. So one is about crisis management. So we recently did a survey of 700 CEOs around the world and asked them whether their organization, their companies, were prepared for one of 15 types of crises. So a cybersecurity, inflation, economic downturn, a workplace violence act, a whole range of, even a pandemic, right? Things that we've been through. A majority of CEOs across the globe said they were unprepared for any of those 15 types of crisis, even the ones we had just gone through. So I'm interested in your perspective on that and what we should be doing differently in the world of crisis management from what we've been doing to make sure that companies are, in fact, prepared for crises that we've either been through or can certainly see coming.
Yeah, and that number does surprise me. I'm not surprised that it's high. I guess I'm surprised that it is that high, especially after we've just come out of periods of major crisis, and we're still in them to some extent, depending on your sector. So, my view, and I am biased toward the day in, day out organizational health things that companies need to do. Business continuity planning has a very important purpose. Crisis planning and the tabletop exercises, can be very important. They can highlight gaps. But to truly navigate a crisis, nothing, I think, will stand you in as good a stead as going into that crisis healthy, you know, with your workforce healthy, with employees engaged, with good relationships with external stakeholder, a good reputation for trying to do the right thing, a reputation for the quality of the goods and services. It sounds kind of boring because, of course, that's what we try to do anyway. But if anything's going to come back to bite us in a crisis, it's going to be those things, not the fact that we didn't do a tabletop exercise last year.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So it's the overall health check that you need to go through, which has to be an honest and robust one, where people feel free to raise the issues, even if they don't necessarily have a solution. I think I've seen this in the corporate world, you probably have too, where there's the annual risk assessment required by the New York Stock Exchange listing standards. And so you present to the board or the audit committee all the risks you have and all of your mitigation strategies. And there's a hesitancy to bring up risks for which you don't feel as if you've got an adequate mitigation strategy. And those are the areas where you're very likely going to have a crisis,
Exactly.
right? And so you've
by
got...
definition, they're the ones in the top right.
Exactly.
Right?
But those are the ones where it can be hard sometimes to have that honest discussion beforehand. And then frankly, I don't know if you've seen this, there's also, after you've been through a crisis, people like to move on. They don't necessarily like to spend the time capturing the lessons learned.
Yeah. You know, it really is true. You know, or we do a superficial exercise.
Right.
We check the box.
Yes.
We said we did an after-action review, and somebody writes a memo. But you know, that really is a tragedy. Sometimes when we've gone through, you know, a really extreme event. That's exactly right. You know, I think learning from what you go through is one of the most powerful things you can do, and sometimes celebrating it.
Yes.
You know, our industry is one that makes big bets. Lots of compounds fail in development, you know, and I think a lot of companies talk about it, but I know it's really hard to do. You know, celebrating people that take appropriate risks that don't always end up well.
Yeah.
But it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to go try. And, you know, when we face a crisis, when something goes wrong, making that okay.
Yes.
You know, and making sure heads don't necessarily roll for the wrong reasons.
Right.
Is really important to overall resilience, because a culture of fear, a culture of being afraid of screwing up or, you know, being called out and made the fall guy, you know, nothing is going to be more detrimental, I think, to a culture of resilience than that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And what goes with that, too, is, you know, when you've made your way through a crisis, you know, recognize the lessons learned and also recognize the strengths that came through during that crisis and build on those strengths, because it's not all bad, right? You've learned the things that you're able to do well during that crisis. And so let's capitalize on those, right? Going forward.
Right. Maybe 3 divisions were at the ready, but the communications didn't flow and you know, they didn't get the right instruction of what to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's not lose what went really well. Let's capture it. Let's reward it. But also reward the guy who raised his hand that said, hey, we really botched this.
Yes, exactly right. And don't shoot the messenger there.
Even if he doesn't have the answer on how to fix it, you need those people willing to say it.
So it seems to me that, you know, people often think about operational resilience, and, you know, there's a range of things that go into it, from your original design of your operations and your supply chain to be resilient, to risk assessment, through crisis management, through business continuity to keep the trains running while you're in a crisis situation, to recovery and all that. That's all sort of focused on the kind of negative, like protecting against all the bad stuff.
Right.
But
That's true.
It does seem to me that if you are resilient, you actually have a comparative advantage over other organizations. So maybe a thing that CEOs might think about is thinking about operational resilience as a comparative advantage. And, you know, maybe even us as individuals think, you know what, it's worth taking time to invest in my own resilience, because no matter what comes at me, I'm going to be the best version of myself.
I think you're exactly right. And the types of resilience muscles we've been talking about, are almost neutral to the type of crisis you face.
Yes.
So who knows whether it'll be a cyber attack or a pandemic or a war on your border. But the types of organizational strengths that companies really should invest in are going to pay off almost no matter what the crisis. It's not going to be, those are sort of no regret moves, I would suggest.
Right. Yeah.
But I think what we don't do is value them high enough. It's because it's very hard to quantify the impact.
Right. And that's one reason why, based on the survey we just did, 89% of people we surveyed, companies we surveyed, said that the threats to resilience are increasing. 86% said it's a strategic priority, but at over 60% of companies, operational resilience sits 3 to 4 levels below the CEO, right? And people aren't necessarily investing in those areas that are important for ongoing health that will help you become more resilient.
And that makes me wonder, though, about how those folks were thinking about who controls resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Because the person responsible for business continuity planning might sit 4 levels down.
Yeah, should well.
But some of the broader organizational health types of
Yes.
things and those culture red warning signs that
Right.
may come back on a company survey, you would like to think that does sit at the level of the leadership team. But maybe not.
But maybe not, and I think
maybe
that's
they're
it.
not thinking
They're
about
not thinking
it
about
that way.
So just like a lot of companies they have a chief sustainability officer. Maybe it's a sustainability and resilience officer, because those two things go hand in hand. Or maybe it's saying our chief operating officer is also our head of resilience. Elevating this up and making sure that it embraces the full range of resilience activities and gets the due attention.
Yeah.
So.
This is getting a lot of attention at governments and governments
Mm-hmm.
around the world as well. The federal government and the Office of Homeland Security has an Office of Resilience.
Yeah.
And, I was having a very interesting conversation the other day with someone that works there. So I do think that reframing some of these good practices that we know about and ticking them up the priority list is maybe a silver lining that comes out of COVID, that comes out of some of the crises that we've seen, is that companies can be more attentive. These are not nice to haves.
No, and yes, and elevating the notion of resilience higher in the pecking order of considerations for companies.
Absolutely.
And not having it just be this bureaucratic function that someone has to do once a year.
Right, that they can demonstrate.
Right.
They've got these plans and they've got these files and the box has been checked. I think that's right, and we don't need to wait for a colossal crisis.
Correct.
Right? One of the things I've learned as I've talked about my book and talked about recovery and the tools that helped me, is that everybody has something. Not everybody got hit by a train, but all of us have faced really tough challenges in our life. Maybe it's a diagnosis, maybe it's the breakup of a relationship,
Right.
maybe it's something with our kids. We all go through something. And, in the corporate world,
Yes.
none of us go through our professional lives without some kind of setback, and companies too. So we shouldn't think of resilience as that rarely, what are we going to do when the black swan event hits? Resilience is day in, day out.
Yes.
And the opportunity to demonstrate it, but also the chance to build
those resilience muscles.
We have opportunities every single day to model as leaders the right kind of habits of thinking, to ask the right kind of questions that build a resilient organization.
Yeah, and this is part of bringing your authentic self to work, is to tap into those lessons from your own personal life and say, wait a second, this actually has some relevance to what I'm doing here at work, because as we've talked about, many of the same attributes of personal resilience will help in corporate resilience too.
And it may be something sometimes as simple as patience.
Yes, right.
There were times when I tried so hard to speed up my recovery.
Yeah.
I was going to get off all these opioids. I wanted to feel what my body really felt like, so I just stopped taking the fentanyl. Well, that didn't end up so.
Right.
I ended up writhing on the floor, unable to breathe. And my doctor said, "What are you thinking?"
Yes.
There's a way to do it. You do it very gradually. You do it under medical supervision.
Yeah.
You don't do it because you got tired of taking the drugs one day and you were feeling fine. And, I had to accept that, it was going to be a different time frame. And that might take longer than I wanted. But that's what I had to learn and roll with. And I think sometimes we're faced with problems and we just want to fix it. We just want an answer. Sometimes, the long, slow road of building up that resilient culture is the right answer.
Yeah, I've served on a lot of nonprofit boards, and one thing I've found are 3 traits that really help in the nonprofit sector. And I think they probably translate to the corporate sector as well, which are patience, perseverance, and purpose.
I like that.
That can help get you through. So just a couple final questions. So June will mark the 1-year anniversary of your memoir, Bone by Bone, being published. Can you talk a little bit about what's been most meaningful to you about sharing your story over the last year, and what's been the reaction?
Yeah, it's been incredibly meaningful. And I didn't write the book for any financial motivation. I'm donating any author proceeds that come in to the American Trauma Society and the Trauma Survivors Network. I wrote the book actually at the suggestion of my old CEO of Merck, former CEO of Merck, Ken Frazier. And he was speaking to me once during a visit, and I'd gone through a particularly difficult surgery. I'd had to be resuscitated yet again a year or 2 after the accident. And he looked at me and he said, "Geralyn, you have to write a book." And I said, "Ken, I don't want to be like, look how strong I am."
Yeah.
I said, I received a gift. I didn't deserve to live, and other people, I feel odd about doing that. And he said, no, you're thinking about this all wrong. He said, you have a story to tell. And so many people go through tough times. Your story can help others. And as he reframed it for me in that way, I thought, maybe this is a way that something good comes out of this accident, because otherwise it's just a black hole in my life for 2.5 years. And, can I make something, can I do something with this? and starting to write, and I don't pretend that the techniques that helped me, the things that helped me will necessarily help everyone. But I learned a lot by reading other memoirs and other stories. And there's power in story. Mm-hmm. It's different than a medical textbook on pain, on managing pain. And so I think by sharing our stories, we really can learn from each other. And it's my effort to pay forward in a tiny way the gifts that I received from so many folks during my recovery. So it's been very meaningful. Some of the high points were an opportunity to present to the board of the American Trauma Society in December, thank them for the work they do in support of trauma medicine and making survival stories like mine possible. So that was very meaningful. I've done some speaking with trauma teams, with physicians, with nurses, around the patient perspective.
Right.
On what it feels like. The head of trauma at Penn once told me, Geralyn, we've never had a patient as severely injured as you were who survived but didn't have a brain injury such that you remember your time in the ICU. Right. You can give us feedback on the care that you received in this complex case. So once again, for me, it feels like I'm doing something with the experience. I'm doing something useful with it, however inadequate that may be. So it's just been such a privilege to connect with medical communities, with communities of faith in different churches, with survivor networks of trauma. I've done some talks on resilience with professional societies, and everybody has a story. Everybody has a story, and that to me is it's healing. I guess it's healing is all the way I can put it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today and in our last session. I think, one of the things that we tend to do when we go through a traumatic experience, crisis, is we do try to move on. But often what we learn through those crises are some of the most important lessons we can learn in our entire lives. So what a lot of companies learned basically going through the pandemic, what lawyers had to go through, for example, and sort of mapping all of the regulatory requirements and all that massive sort of challenge worldwide, that same sort of process can help companies today dealing with a whole array of different challenges that come out in a world of, geopolitical uncertainty, economic uncertainty, polarization, all those sorts of traits that we learn during these times of crisis, during these times of disruption, can really be brought to bear again and again. And as you said, all of us have a story to tell. Not as dramatic as yours.
Well, but lots of folks do.
but also quite meaningful, which means that all of us have the opportunity to share our own stories of personal resilience, however they may come through, with our colleagues and bring that to bear in the work that we do.
That's exactly right. There's a lot of attention these days to authenticity in leadership. And while nobody wants to work with someone who overshares constantly their personal life, I think maybe one silver lining of the pandemic is we have felt a little more comfortable talking about the things we're struggling with. When you see somebody's 2-year-old crawl in the back of a Zoom call, they're just that little bit much more human. And being straightforward, not only about the things you struggle with, but the things that helped you.
Yes.
There are lessons there. And we can. It was friends of mine that said, you really should try this meditation thing. And I rolled my eyes, but I did it, and lo and behold, it helped.
And as you said, sharing those stories of resilience and connecting on them make you more resilient and make your community, make your company also more resilient. So 100%. We all have a purpose in sharing our stories of resilience, and that we help ourselves and we help others. So with that, Geralyn, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you all for listening to the second installment of our conversation with Geralyn Ritter about resilience. You can listen to ESG News and Views wherever you get your podcasts. And please visit the Conference Board website, tcb.org, for links and resources on the topics we've discussed today. Thank you all for listening, and be well.
Thank you.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.